Thanks to Beth and Sherry. Appreciate it very much. Terrell is traveling away this week and next week. Glad to have Beth back with us and Beth's mom, Sherry. Beautiful song. It's appropriate to this particular sermon today and is often linked to it because Jesus will bring up similar thoughts to those expressed in the song later on in this chapter. But today I want to talk to you about being rich toward God, and that's really the challenge that we see before us as we look through this gospel reading today. I want to begin not by asking for a show of hands, but for you to think for a moment, if you will. How many of you, don't show your hands, we're not going to out anybody. How many of you have ever been a part of a family dispute or at least tension in the family over an inheritance? Again, some of you are laughing, so I'm assuming you're not raising your hands, but you're reflecting on moments when those kinds of things have happened, right? As a pastor, I've had people through the years come to me and tell me about stories where their families have been kind of torn apart over sometimes issues of significant possessions, but also sometimes very minor things. You can imagine, we talked about this in the Bible study, how sometimes it's some of the little simple things that are of sentimental value that people cling to, and they can argue and fuss and fight with one another about them. They can cause a great deal of tension. That's the background to this story today. I remember as a child when my father was the youngest of 10 children. And I remember when my grandmother died, my grandfather had passed away, my father's mother. Grandfather had passed away years before I was born, but when my grandmother died, those 10 siblings, they had a rough time trying to work out how to divide up what was left, what remained afterwards. And some of them didn't speak to one another for years, and some of them sued one another on different occasions. It was tough, and I remember that growing up. And it can create problems that take forever, if a lifetime, to get over. Well, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples have basically left everything behind. Houses, land, businesses, even family, because he has set his face toward Jerusalem. He's already been telling people that he's going there really to die and, of course, be raised. But he's going to die. He is leaving it all behind. But he has this in the process of making his way toward Jerusalem. We're told that crowds, sometimes numbering in the thousands, he was encountering them on a regular basis. In one such occurrence, an individual pops up and says to Jesus, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. It was a family dispute, apparently between two brothers. Jesus referred to him as man, so it was a man, a brother, in a dispute with his brother about the family inheritance. Jesus' response is pretty abrupt. He's almost, well, you can tell Jesus is a little bit ticked off here. Because it says, well, who am I? Who's made me the judge or an arbiter over you? That's not my business. I'm not probate court. Now, it's not uncommon in the ancient world for people in the Israelite or Jewish villages to go to the local rabbi or religious teacher to get some guidance and some authoritative advice on how to manage these disputes. You go all the way back to Moses, and you find Moses did that for the people of Israel, and also he appointed judges who did it the same. And there are even texts in the Hebrew Scriptures that talk about how to properly divide the inheritance. And it's a little bit different than in modern 21st century America. Some different principles. I'm going to read you just one example that might raise some eyebrows, but it gives you an idea of how they looked at family inheritance issues. This is from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 21, starting verse 15. Hang on. If a man has two wives, one of them loved and the other disliked, and if both the loved and the disliked have borne him sons, the firstborn being the son of the one who is disliked, then on the day when he wills his possessions to his sons, he is not permitted to treat the son of the loved as the firstborn in preference to the son of the disliked, who is the firstborn. He must acknowledge as firstborn, the son of who is disliked, giving him a double portion of all that he has. Since he is the first issue of his virility, the right of the firstborn is his. That's kind of complicated, isn't it? That's in the Bible. You didn't know that, did you? In the ancient Jewish world, a firstborn son had a right to a double portion of the inheritance. That could be not only create resentment when you're actually trying to divide out based on those kinds of fractions, it can get even more complicated, especially when much of it was tied up in land and livestock. Well, here's an instance from the Hebrew Torah where it even takes into consideration if a man has two wives. By the way, in the ancient world, if you're wondering about that was perfectly acceptable for the ancient Hebrews, and it was encoded into the Torah. They even have how they regulate it here in the case of inheritance. So you can understand that was a different world than today to a great extent in many ways. But what we encounter in this story is closer to what you read there than it is to what you might read now. So there's a lot of issues that have to be resolved. But when Jesus is confronted with this, Jesus is dismissive. He's like, what's this? And you understand his mindset. Jesus not only is willing to give up everything for the sake of the kingdom of God and has taught his disciples to be the same way, Jesus has also been announcing the kingdom of God is near. So his vision was that the entire political and economic regime that was currently in place was about to pass off the scene. And that colors almost everything Jesus said about wealth. It's kind of like Jesus would... I would compare it to, say, investing in Confederate dollars in March of 1865. That would have been a bad investment, right? For Jesus, believing that the kingdom of God was so near and things were about to have a dramatic change, investing in anything like worrying so much about family inheritance that you were willing to be divided with your brother over it, Jesus is very dismissive of that. And he uses this encounter and his resistance to be tied up into a family dispute about inheritance as an opportunity to teach a profound lesson. He tells them to take care, this man, to take care. And others are listening as well. Take care, be careful. Be careful that you not believe that life consists of the possessions that you have or own. Life is more than simply the accumulation of more stuff. And that is the lesson that he is going to teach today. It is the theme of his teachings on different occasions. This is the first of three parables where he specifically uses a rich man as an example of how people can be so caught up in accumulating more material possessions that they can lose track of the most important things. Remember, one of the other rich man parables is the Rich Man and Lazarus, where a rich man passes by a poor man named Lazarus who is sitting outside of his gate every day and does not even give him crumbs from his table, while the poor man Lazarus is in agony. And the great reversal. That is what Jesus proclaimed. The kingdom of God was near, and when the kingdom of God fully arrived, there would be a great reversal of fortune, literally. The rich were warned of living lives in callous disregard of the poor because one day God would turn the tables. And the rich would be poor in the eyes of God, and the poor would be rich in the eyes of God, depending on how they focused on the kingdom of God. So Jesus uses this principle of life does not consist in the things that we own to launch into a parable. It was Jesus' custom to use stories. Matthew's gospel says that Jesus, every time he taught, he would always use a story. It was his style. So he tells the story of a rich landowner. Terry just read it just a moment ago. I'll give you the synopsis. This rich landowner had a windfall. He was already wealthy. We're told that. And he was wealthy in land, which in that world was really the basis of the economy. You had essentially two types of people. There were other merchants and business people in the middle, but there were landowners, and then by and large you had a population of day laborers who depended upon landowners to employ them for a daily wage, a denarius, and that's how they made their living. So the most powerful people at that time were the landowners. And this was a wealthy landowner. He had a lot. And it had a bumper crop. His land, it says, produced in abundance. Something, by the way, he couldn't take ultimate credit for, because I grew up on a farm, and I remember Dad always telling us, we can plow the land, we can plant the seed, we can fertilize it, but the rain is out of our control. And the land and the fertility of the land is what produces the crop. So much about farming is out of your control. This man prospered, had an abundant windfall of his crop. It was a gift of God. But what did he do when he was already wealthy, what did he do when he realized he was going to have such a bumper crop? Well, he had an internal conversation with himself. He began to plot and plan his own future. We all do this. We think a windfall's coming, maybe a raise or a gift or winning the lottery or whatever you do. You start planning and plotting. I'm going to do this and that and the other thing. We all, as human beings, especially as Americans, we carry around in our brains this list of things we'd like to have if we had the money, right? Well, he had his own list in his own mind, so he began to talk to himself and have that internal conversation that he was going to tear down his barns. He already had barns full of produce and goods, but he needed bigger barns. And when he would store all this abundance, this windfall of a crop into his barns, then he could rest and he could eat and he could drink and he could be merry. He was set for life. I remember Tom Wolfe wrote a novel, Bonfire of the Vanities. I don't know if you ever saw that. Maybe you didn't read the book, but you saw the movie that developed from it. Sherman McCoy, he had reached the apex of his career. He had it all. He had wealth. He had great plans for himself. He called himself a master of the universe. And then if you know the story, his life begins to unravel dramatically from there on out. Again, like we say, we make plans, God laughs. But we all can have that imagination. Even if we've never been rich, we can all imagine what it would be like. I remember when that popular show, when was it, back in the late 80s and the 90s, with Robin Leach, Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Remember that? And you watch that stuff and you're like, wow. And you can see that and you can think, wow, that would be nice. Have all that. Yeah, you think about that, and we humans do that. There is something within human nature that can be insatiable, that we believe that if we just get that next thing or have that next experience or that bigger house or that bigger car or that, name it, if we can just get that, then we'll be happy and we'll be set for life. We'll become our own master of the universe. But you remember the punchline, right? There's that verse 20, but God intervenes and says, you fool, tonight your life will be demanded of you. The giver of life decides to take it back. In part because of the individual's greed and lack of gratitude. Because not once are we told that when he receives this abundance, this big crop, ultimately a gift of God, not once do we see him having a conversation with himself which says, thank God, God has blessed me with this. Maybe I'm blessed to be a blessing to others. Nowhere in his internal conversation was, I got all of this, much more than I can ever need or use. Why don't I look around me and realize that there are poor people around me who have nothing? Or could he have just said, maybe the day laborers should deserve a little more for helping me bring in this great abundance of crop? You see how this works? We can become so obsessed with acquiring more, getting more, that we can lose God and others in the process. It becomes just an exercise in self-absorption. And this is not just for the wealthy. This can happen to anybody. Just put a test to yourself. when you sit down and think about, I'm not advocating participation in the lottery, okay, but imagine if you ever had that thought in your mind, boy, if I won the big lottery, you go by past the signs all the time, oh, that's $250 million. You start thinking, and what do? Is anywhere on the list of things that go through your mind helping people who are poor by giving a majority of it away to people who need and who have nothing at all? Most of us do not. We just simply go through our mental list of all the wonderful things we would like to have and all the beautiful places we would like to visit. And if we're not careful, we're just as guilty of this as this rich fool. Amen. Because we have come to believe that life consists in the abundance of possessions that we have obtained. But guess what? We came into this world with nothing. I mentioned in the Bible study time, I was there for the birth of all three of my children. My wife was really there, but I was there. I was there. They were born with nothing. I even had to pay the doctor. You didn't get that. They had nothing to offer. They were born. They were brought into the world with nothing. And guess what? We say he died rich or she died rich. Really, once you die, you're not rich anymore because you leave it all behind. And then somebody has to pay for your own funeral. Well, you could plan ahead, but someone finishes the final arrangements, and then you leave it once again. We're about right back where we started from at the end of this story. Somebody now has to some family members start gathering around because Dad's dead, and they're going to have to argue over the stuff he left behind. And Jesus concludes, such is the individual who is rich toward himself but not toward God. So what did Jesus define as being rich toward God? Well, if you look at Jesus' life and the way he's described, even in the Gospel of Matthew, you notice Jesus was not opposed to enjoying life. He had a reputation of being a drunkard and a glutton. And if you invite him over for dinner, every time Jesus seemed to say, yeah, I'll go, no matter who it was. And he enjoyed it. And he enjoyed laughing. I think he was merry. You can't read some of Jesus' words without thinking he didn't say some of it with his tongue in his cheek and with a twinkle in his eye. So it's not the notion that there's something inherently wrong with enjoying good food and good drink and being merry and having happiness and joy with other family and friends and so forth. But what Jesus is warning about is that we not begin to obsess about the notion that somehow that he or she who dies with the most things is really rich. Ralph likes to say, and they've never seen a hearse with a U-Haul being pulled behind it. You've heard that before. A great question: how much did a rich person leave behind? Every bit of it. That's what we all are. That's who we all are, ultimately. So what is Jesus' lesson? Well, he goes on into the next few verses, and he tells his disciples how to truly be rich. He tells them he told them to sell your possessions. Now, I don't think he meant reduce yourself to a state of poverty where you didn't depend on others, but sell your possessions, especially those you have in abundance. Give alms. Alms means gifts to the poor, those who don't have enough. The idea that those who have more than enough can help those who have less than enough, so everybody can at least have enough. That'd be an ideal world. And so that maybe instead of having that list that we think, oh, if I have this, this, and the other thing, then I'll be happier, or I'll really have arrived, maybe we would include at the top of that list how that we can use some of the abundance that we have to empower other people to have a better life and more moments of good eating and good drinking and merriment. That's what it means to be rich toward God. It's no matter where you are, no matter what you have, and no matter what you get, that first and foremost in the thought process is how can I use the abundance that I have been given to help someone else who's experiencing scarcity, so all of us, or at least more of us, in more places, can have enough. And that's what it means, I think, in part, to be rich toward God.